did you first know that you wanted to develop a career in media?
Well, I think when I was about 20, it was quite late, I suddenly thought, yeah, this is something I really could envisage myself earning a career and earning money in. But I think, before it was always there. I'd loved TV, as a kid. I loved watching TV. I loved listening to radio. And I also loved newspapers. And that sounds a bit weird, I guess. I was at a boarding school in England. And after lunch, we'd be sat down every day to read a book or whatever. And a few of us started ordering newspapers. I thought, wow, this is really grown up. And I really got interested in them. And, I'd started off, I think as most kids do, with stories. We love stories. And I remember reading Marvel comics, at 7 and 8. These are great stories. And I also loved history. And history seemed to be that link, really, between story and reality. The earliest historian, Herodotus, you read Herodotus, the histories, and it's gods are coming in, and you think, well, is this real? Is this a myth? And there was a sort of halfway house between the two. And I think, maybe that's why I liked, the Marvel superheroes. And, I did ancient history and then medieval history. And I never liked the modern history particularly because the stories weren't as seemingly dramatic as they were from years ago. But when I got into my late teens and early 20s, I realized that the stories that were happening in the real world were just as exciting and interesting as those that were created by, fictional writers. So I think that's when I realized, yeah, I like to understand what's happening. These people, these extraordinary people who are, creating empires and creating huge issues that people write about for good or bad. And I loved writing. I always loved writing. And I remember, again, at boarding school, every month we would have a list. The teacher would read down the list, from, bottom to first. And I remember once, second Faulkner, and first Stuart Jones. Great. French, last Stuart Jones. And I had this, I just loved writing. And then I loved photography as well. Somehow, either you had an eye for it or I just enjoyed composition. Couldn't paint for my life or draw. But suddenly there was a camera and you could create. And again, I seemed quite good at it. And I almost became a photographer just after university. And then I thought, well, why don't I combine the two, the love of writing and the love of image? And there was, I remember, it was about a year since I passed my undergraduate degree. And I hadn't got a job, this was back in about 81, 82. And my mother, she'd been in the bank. And I thought, well, if I can't do something, I can always perhaps go into the family business and join a bank. Then there was an advert in the Guardian, which is the English national newspaper, left of centre, but it specialises in media. And it said, we've got an opening at the National Broadcasting School for a trainee radio reporter. We will train you in how independent radio newsrooms in the UK want their journalists to write. But you have to have a degree and you have to be able to give a cheque of, I don't know, £500 or something in the next few days. So I thought, well, I'll go for this. And I sold my motorbike and I got on the course. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Looking back from where you are now, what was the most important element of your educational process? You mentioned graduate school, undergraduate.
Yeah.
What stands out as really helping you along the way?
I think there were a lot of things, and I might mention this a lot, but I went to boarding school. The English back in, well, they don't do it so much now, but they would often send their sons and later daughters off to boarding school. And I went at the age of about 8 and left at 19. So most people sort of stay at home until they're 19 and then sort of leave. And I left at 8 and went back to live with my mother at 19. So I was really confused. But education to me was, it's part camaraderie. I was an only child. I grew up as an only child. So I didn't have a lot of friends living nearby. Suddenly in boarding school, there were 500 of them, So this, it was a fun environment. But the learning process, it was a bit like being in a toy shop or a sweet shop. So many exciting things to learn. Wasn't good at everything, obviously, but I've always had this fascination to discover things. That sense of interest, being quizzical. School provided that. And if you get the right teacher that allows you to do that and doesn't sort of box you in and just have you on, railroad tram lines, then education is a wonderful thing. I think one of the things that taught me was always be inquisitive and always contextualize. I was fascinated by the idea, there's a line that says, this is the only way it is, and it just is. And you want to understand, well, how did it get there? Did it mean the same thing to somebody else? And as you get older, you discover more gradations of life experience. Is it the same for a woman as a man? Is it the same for a lord as a pauper? Is it the same for a Muslim as a Christian? So I think that was what I took away from education.
What is the main thing it taught you?
At school? Or?
At the first job that you had?
The first job that I had, so I went along to the National Broadcasting School, and the top 3 got placements. And I got placed at a small local radio station on the south coast of England, 2 Counties Radio. And I was there only for about 2 weeks. And I lived in a place called Brighton, which was along the coast, about 100 miles. And suddenly an opening came up there in that radio station for a junior reporter. So I see that really as my first job. I think the first 2 weeks at 2 Counties was just a shock. Wow, it's this intense. But I was at Southern Sound Radio for about 5 years.
Okay.
And I went from being a person who sort of who did the traffic report and travel in the morning at 5 a.m. through to being the news editor and sports editor. So I think, local radio, local journalism is a wonderful place to learn your trade. And you learn how to do things and how not to do things. You often things you take away. When my first job, first day, it's 5 in the morning, and there's me and the newsreader and some other journalist, and I'm writing some copy for him to read, the newsreader to read. And I'm not the greatest typist in the world, so I made 1 or 2 mistakes, but in journalism school they told you just draw a line from the word just over the one that you've crossed out. So the newsreader's eye will bounce across the 2. And I did that, and the newsreader came out and he hit me around the head. He said, "Don't you do that to me again." And I'm thinking, wow, well, it's 5 in the morning. It's my first morning. And I thought, if ever I get to be a boss, I will never treat someone like that. And I think in one way, you learn from negatives. And there was always, hopefully, a respect for people if you want them to give their best. And maybe it was just a style of management that was big in those days, sort of very aggressive. And it wasn't just media, but things have changed.
Who are your mentors, and what role have they played in your life and in your career?
I've always had a challenge with almost celebrity culture. I've often felt it's sort of overrated, but there is somebody journalistically who meant an awful lot to me. His name's Roger Bolton. He was a British, mainly BBC producer, current affairs producer. And he was my boss, Thames Television, the independent television network in the UK. Okay. And then when he left to create his own production company, he took me with him. So I was probably worked with him for about 10, 12 years. But I think what he talked to me about was the integrity of journalism. No matter where you are, there is truth as you see it, and you should report it. And he got into an awful lot of trouble in the UK over some of the way he covered the Northern Ireland crisis and the Troubles, which was at odds with some of the BBC approaches to how the journalism should be done. There are 2 sides of the story, and they should be told, was Roger's view. I think he actually got sacked from the BBC over it, not once, but I think it was twice. And then he went on and stood up against huge opposition over another news story called Death on the Rock, where some IRA terrorists were killed by British security forces. And the story of that, and how as a journalist he really pushed to get to the truth, and how the forces of the establishment were lined up against him. So, there's a journalist who put his neck on the line.
Yeah.
And I always admired him for that, greatly.
Do you feel like there's still that type of journalistic ethic out there today, especially, the whole business model for media is so different now. It's very opinion-oriented or right or left. What do you think about that business
That's
model?
been a huge change. You're right. The idea of journalism is their objectivity. I mean, one of the degree I did was philosophy, theology and philosophy, and so all these questions of can there be objectivity, etc., fascinated me. But within journalism, it's almost, I think, what is the job of a journalist? And in a democracy, I think there is the importance of informing an electorate. You cannot have an effective democracy without an informed electorate. And it needs to be informed as objectively as you can. If you are just peddling one side of the argument or one perspective, then that isn't helping democracy. You're just talking to the choir, reinforcing positions which may actually be misguided in the sense that you don't have the facts to make the decision. So I think it's been a huge detriment to journalism, but democracy, this lining up on one side or the other. If I want a shouting match, then I don't go to a newsroom. But unfortunately today you do.
So true.
Yeah.
Is it a ratings game, money, ratings,
I think
revenue?
it is. It is difficult. I mean, if you're after ratings, objectivity isn't probably going to bring it in. If you're after entertainment with somebody going for someone else's jugular, then it's bread and circuses, and that'll bring in the ratings. Somewhere along the line, there has to be a balance in broadcasting. I will forever be a huge fan of the UK and the BBC because of the public service money that's put in. Not to say the BBC is always right, but there's these issues. Will the market of itself take care of what is important? And if it doesn't, then it needs help. That's where not-for-profits come in. That's where you would hope effective, objective news comes in. It shouldn't be all about chasing ratings because we're human, we have weaknesses, and sometimes we need a bit of help.
What have been the proudest moments of both your personal life and your business life?
Well, start with the personal life. Any parent would say their children, so I am going to start there. And I have 3 wonderful daughters, Rhiannon, Sarah, Francesca. One of the exciting things of being a parent is passing on to them the joy that you find in life. I mean, there was a simple thing, very simple thing with Francesca. She's 7, and I loved sport. I wanted to be a jock, and I ran track a lot. And I remember she just won an important race in the village, and it was clear that she had a huge gift as a sportswoman. And so I took her to an athletics track, and it was like introducing her to this is a great way, this part of being that you are good at, that you will have fun at. I had great fun being in athletics. And now I'm going to pass that to you. With Rhiannon, she loves acting. She's a beautiful singer. She likes performing. And as a TV presenter, I loved performing in a way. And I was so proud that she had that in her and would take that to a level I could never pull off. And Sarah loves history, and I adore reading history. If there's a history show that comes on, I'm half watching it, half on my iPad, reading around it as the thing's going on, and then the show finishes and I get, right, I'm going to go away and buy every book on the Medes and Persians or something. And there is that passion. History is just a wonderful source of inspiration about what this species, this race can do, this species can do. And to have a daughter who shares that. So yes, that's very important to me. I think conversely, mentioning sport again, I loved playing sport, and I was a high jumper and a 110-meter hurdler, and won the county championships. And I think when I was about 17, I think I won my first one, and they gave me a little medal. And I thought, fantastic, what a medal! And then I remember thinking, wow, if I do nothing else in my life, my name will be in a book somewhere that in 1977, Nick Stewart-Jones won the Sussex County High Jump Championship or something, you know. Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I love outdoors. I mean, I love walking, that sense of, I don't know whether you just get more oxygen in yourself, but suddenly it's enlivening. And so that was important to me. And I remember, to bring the two together, being with Rhiannon once about 10 years ago, we were climbing up a hillside in the Trossachs in Scotland. There was a waterfall, a 100-foot waterfall at the top. And we climbed up to the waterfall, and we were with a friend of mine who'd been a producer, TV producer, and we did an on-the-spot fake news report, the three of us, by the waterfall. And then we began to run down the hill. And it was quite a steep hill, and we fell over. And we just rolled down for about, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 minutes. And then we stopped, and we just couldn't stop laughing. And that sense of just being and having such fun was magical.
So are you happy that Scotland didn't leave the UK?
That was a tough one, wasn't it?
What did you think was going to happen, and why do you think they voted no?
That they would stay in.
Oh, you did, okay.
I think, you know, when it comes to elections, I mean, the psychology of why anyone does anything fascinates me. The way people view, the way people watch and consume media, whether it be on an iPhone, a big plasma screen, a giant screen, you know, outdoors, it fascinates me. How people vote fascinates me as well. In England, in Britain, if you go for a local election, then the more liberal, progressive side often comes out. So parties that would not really get a chance of getting into government, but could operate well at local levels, like the Green Party, Environmental Party. And in Britain at the moment, the Lib Dems, although they are now in power, but when I was living there, they weren't getting anywhere near government. But at local elections, people would vote for that. They voted with their conscience a bit more. When it comes to the big one, and you know, this is the way your country will be run in the next 4 years, there's a bit of caution creeps in. And so you tend to vote a little more cautiously, it seems to me. Yeah. Now, when it came to the independent vote, that was the biggest election. I mean, I was thinking about it. It was more than when Britain voted to go into the European Union, I think. I mean, this had been a union, you know, since the early part of the 18th century. And we'd achieved wonderful things together. And I say it as a person who lived in England, but whose father and grandfather were born and lived just outside Edinburgh. So, you know, the Scottish heritage sort of runs deep, and when I was about 11, my ambition as a sportsman was to play in goal for Scotland in the World Cup. So I looked at this question and thought, actually, I think Scotland should stay in.
Really?
You know, they've achieved an awful lot, and we've been able to hold on to a glorious heritage. And that's what happened in the end. There was a lot of publicity towards the end, the polls saying that it was going to be a yes vote.
Yeah.
And I thought, no, this is the way people vote. Up to when you get in the booth, you let your ambitions fly all over the place. You dream. And then when you're in the booth, reality hits.
You've done everything from report from war zones to produce music videos to documentaries. Give us a brief picture of that trajectory of your career, because I'm really interested in why you might say that it's important to develop a diverse skill set in the course of your career.
Yes, but when you sort of listed those things, you think, oh boy, you know, am I jack of all trades? And you know, in some
or
ways,
just really talented.
Really talented. You know, there's a danger that you diversify too much. I mean, you know, I've already spoken or I've mentioned that different perspectives are very, very important. And I think you can get too lasered into one perspective sometimes. And this isn't to decry experts. I mean, you need to be experts, but to understand something, you need to come at it from many different ways. I mean, the BBC 10, 15 years ago talked about a new way to approach covering or programming. And, you know, they would take an object. You know, they would say, I said, take water. And they say, right, science department, how are you going to handle that? Music, how are you going to handle that? Sport, that's an easy one, perhaps. Religion, how are you going to handle that? So that's what I mean about different perspectives on something. If I look at you from just this angle forever, I never get to see or understand the rest of you. But if I'm invited round or someone else's perspective on you is presented to me, then a fuller picture emerges. And so that's what I liked about the career I've had. It's given me a 360 on life.
In the UK, you were the CEO of a production company called CTV See, which you pretty much went in and reinvented in a lot of ways. Tell us a little about that experience.
That was my first job as a CEO. I really had no idea what I was getting into. In fact, somebody rang me, a friend, and said, oh, there's an ad in the Guardian newspaper. My career has been linked to the Guardian newspaper's job section. And he said, I don't know what exactly the job is, I can't remember. I think it's a head of development of stories, coming up with ideas. I thought, well, yeah, I think I could do that. And I found the ad, and it was for a CEO. And I'd never really wanted to be a CEO, but I thought, well, hang on, it's specializing in an area that I specialize in, religion. And what was I then, 40, 42? And I thought, it's about time. So I got the job and really discovered a company which had a very a long history, a well-respected history, but perhaps time and markets had changed dramatically. And I think you'll find with the onset of technology or the loosening of sort of vertical structures within societies that the model it had was now fighting the market and the... So I discovered really a skill set to, I think, break down and rebuild. And in many ways, that's what I've done since. I've gone to companies where I've had to break down and rebuild. And somebody once told me there are two types of bosses. There's one who's good at breaking down and rebuilding and then gets bored. And there's another one who is just really good at getting a company which is pretty much there. And they're two very different skill sets. I remember I covered the fall of communism in Czechoslovakia, that was, and talking to some of the leaders that had been involved in bringing the people on, inspiring them to break down communism and have the strength to move on to a post-communist era. And somebody once said to me, the people who've broken down are not the ones to build our future. It needs a very different skill set. I've always wanted the challenge of creating a vision and then building it. And then luckily CTV See in a way gave me that perspective. It was a wonderful organization, but it had got entrenched in an old way of doing things in media. And in the end, I had to shut it down, in effect, or shut down the building. We were based in a wonderful mock Tudor mansion just outside London, in a place called Bushey. It had wonderful studios, oak paneling, wonderful big oil paintings on the walls, a gardener, an under gardener, you know.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, well, how does this work if you're making a television program? I can understand the studio, but you know, we've got a very big place. And in years ago, when you had time and money, and you would go there, and you know, it'd be great to put your production team, and it'd be great to have the studio there, and you have the gardens and the restaurant. It's an all-in-one stop shop.
Wow.
Fantastic. But everything was changing. You know, you didn't need a studio to do a studio shoot, put it that way. There were many ways to do it. And so budgets were falling. There wasn't the money to make studio programs anymore. All overheads were being, you know, really pushed down. There was no way you could actually keep up those wonderful grounds and gardens. And that was hard to break into something and knock it down and then move. We moved next to Tower Bridge in London. And we went from about 30 people down to about 5. Rebuilt. And I think, you know, we ended up with about, I don't know, in the year, 30 hours of television on mainstream TV. And we'd reinvented ourselves.
In this process, which sounds like it was quite difficult, and you had to make very difficult decisions, how did you lead the staff? How did you get them to, get on board and come with you during these difficult decisions?
I mean, that's very hard. I mean, I think when you're in crisis, as I think, there's a description of companies facing something like that, everyone is worried. And in terms of man management, I think a leader's signals come from the leader as to how worried should I be? Should I be really worried? Or, is there some path you're going to lead us onto, some promised land? And then there's always the realization that not everybody's going to make it. And it's a hard lesson to learn when you go on and there's a sort of family-like group. Yeah. But you work out where you want to go, where you think the future is for this organization. You reinvent it, first of all, in here and in here, because I think they have to be both. I really don't see how you can just, a leader, just go to a set of figures and say, you see it works. You have to genuinely believe it because you're dealing with human beings. Then you've got to work out what it's going to take to get you from where you are now to where you want to be, and what skill sets are needed. Not everybody will have those skill sets. And then you go to the stage where, well, do you want to learn them? Are you excited by this? What I love so much is working for companies where everyone is excited. I mean, it doesn't mean every day, but I want to see a spark in someone, that this isn't just a paycheck. It might be important, it might just be fun, it might be, but something to bring you alive as a human being. And if the person doesn't have that, and when you've sort of created the vision of where you want to go, and they still don't get it or still don't want to go, then you're probably going to have to part company. And it may not be them, it may be, the leader with their vision. It's just not the right fit anymore. And you move on, and it's always painful. And if it's not, then I really don't think you're doing your job properly. I mean, I remember the first time I had to let somebody go, I was 24, 25. I'd just become a news editor. And there was this young woman, and she'd come out of university, really friendly, really bubbly. She had passion, she wanted to be a journalist. At that moment, she just wasn't what I needed. She wasn't got the skill set. Yeah. I remember lying awake the night before going, I can't do this. I mean, this poor woman, it's her first job, and she's, it's awful. That was too much, that's too much. You can't carry that on your shoulder as a leader all the time. Right. But if you don't think of that person as a human being and honor them in that way, then the relationship between the two of you, leader and staff, probably working with you, is not built on solid foundations.
You introduced something called TrueTube in the UK. Tell us a little bit about that, with the model, the successes of it.
CTV See was a traditional broadcast outfit. And we made documentaries, programs, hour-long programs to go out on the BBC or ITV, Channel 4. But it was getting harder and harder and harder to do that. The gatekeepers were changing. One of the problems with the religion, I think, on television had been protected for too long. And so the creativity hadn't come through. And there was this perfect storm of broadcasting wanting to maximize its return, for which religion was not really going to do it in a big way. And a situation where I don't think religious program makers in the main had really moved with the creative opportunities that was happening. Again, the vertical structures were breaking down. I mean, I remember when I started, you couldn't become a producer till you were about 30, 35. You couldn't become a camera person until you'd served, in the trenches for several years, decades. And, it was rare that the junior researcher would be given their head, you were there to research something which the gods up the vertical structure would come up with. I remember when I went to CTV, he said, I don't care where the idea comes from. It could be my head of development, or it could be the receptionist. But if you, the receptionist, have an idea, and your uncle just happens to be the person to give us access to this great idea, then I want to hear from you. And I think business was changing like that, and it was all for the better. But as I say, religion had been slow, I think, in doing this. So it was becoming clear our markets were going, our traditional markets were going. We had to diversify. And the web was really taking hold, and the access to it and the mobile access to the web was beginning to evolve as well. So this is the This is 2003, 4, 5.
Okay.
So the idea was that we should go direct to the consumer. We wouldn't go through the gatekeepers. You know, there was another way to market. And again, we wanted to do something with young people. And so we came up with this idea called TrueTube, and it span off actually a television program that I'd done called The Big Question, where we took about 30 15-year-olds from all the different faiths, and none, so you know, there's sort of agnostics there, there's a pagan there was, you know, Catholic, Protestant, Baha'i, Jain, Muslim, and everything we could think of we put into this. And the key bit was that we took from each faith conservative, a progressive, and somewhere in the middle. And we just had 3 rostra seats, yes, no, maybe, and we would put a question to them, a moral question. I mean, eating meat is wrong, or something, or, you know. Then sort of techno music went, lights span, and they just had to charge across the centre of the room to take up the position they had. Huh. You had to give physical assent to your moral position on this.
Oh, interesting.
And what was so fascinating was when the lights went up and you saw in that split second how everyone had lined up. Almost every time the progressive liberal was next to the progressive Jew, next to the progressive Muslim. Huh. And on the other side, the conservative, it was replicated. Huh. So I thought, this is amazing. This shows that it's not religion that's a problem, it's politics. You know, it was a very successful show. And it showed me that teenagers had a really interesting contribution and perspective on moral debate. Because I'd made many programs with adults on these issues, political talks, moral discussions, shows. And when I try to replicate that in a more interesting way with teenagers, I just discovered this wonderful perspective that I never got with adults. Huh. And I thought, how do we do it again? How do we replicate it again? And TrueTube was to put up videos about a moral perspective question, and then teenagers would flip the camera around and give their reaction and then upload it. Now it evolved, TrueTube. In the first year it won, I think, Britain's top education innovation award. So we knew we were onto something. And it evolved, and it's won several European Union grants, and I think it's just picked up another one. So to give teenagers a voice where they are and to honor their perspective is what TrueTube is doing.
What was it that appealed to you about coming to the US, coming to Odyssey Networks, and tell us a little bit about where it was and where you've taken it since you've been on board as the CEO?
I think it was 2008, and I was at a history documentary makers conference here in New York. And I'd known about Odyssey. Odyssey is probably the world's biggest multimedia, multi-faith, not-for-profit organization. So if you're at the Cannes TV Festival looking for someone to partner with on a production, Odyssey was always someone near the top of the list for you to go and see. So I knew of Odyssey, and I had to do a speech. I think it was about, I can't remember the topic, but the outgoing CEO of Odyssey said, I liked what you had to say. Have you ever thought of moving to America, because I'm stepping down? And I remember being, you know, thrilled by this prospect that somebody should think that I could do that. And I'd been a sort of foreign correspondent. I'd traveled a lot as a current affairs presenter. And I would spend 2-3 weeks sometimes in a country, and I would get just a taste of that. And I would sometimes think, wow, I wonder what it'd be like to live abroad. And because I'd spent so much time around, but I never actually uproots, you know, and moved. And so when this came along, I thought, well, this is probably one of my last chances to do that, you know. And oh my goodness, it's New York. I mean, growing up in Britain, you know, watching the movies, you know, I always assumed New York was the capital of the world. I assumed that if aliens landed, they would say, take me to New York, because that's where your leader must be. And so I was thrilled about the opportunity that it was New York. I was thrilled that it was someone with such an important track record and commitment to serious programming as Odyssey. And it was something that I felt I had to do. And what I found was something similar in the way to what I found at CTV See. Here had been a behemoth, a giant in the past, and it had quite a rigid way of doing things and a structured way. And, that had really replicated, I think, the whole business approach in the 80s and some of the 90s, but things were loosening up. And I think this was an organization that was looking for a vision. It had its own channel once, it no longer had its channel. So what could it do if it didn't have a channel? And I think they looked to me to come up with something. And again, the deep problem was, how do you break down something really solid and rebuild it? It's been a tough job, and we've seen people who were there go and new staff come in, whole new ways of doing things, whole new relationships built around different things, getting boards to see things differently, learning the difference as well between US and UK approaches. So it's a huge learning curve. And it's taken 5 years, but where we are, we are probably delivering more programming to more people than we've probably ever done.
What would you say is the biggest learning you've had from these 5 years of transition, breaking down and building back up this company, either personally and business minded?
The importance of heart in this. You've really got to believe in this. I mean, you are going to embark upon a path which will affect other people's lives and maybe even the future of your company. Will it survive? And I think you have to be really certain in a very uncertain environment, because the creation around media, the change in structures everywhere, whether it be, government or churches and synagogues, organizations, again, that vertical structure has been challenged all the time. The way you do business, the way you relate to other people, to your markets. The technology completely changed the way the power stays like that. That uncertain market, and add into that a recession.
Right as you came in.
Recession.
Right?
Yeah. It's one thing to reinvent in an era of milk and honey.
Right.
When you're in a famine, that is a lot harder to do. But it makes you think a lot deeper. One thing I've always felt is that you cannot do it alone. You really do need people to believe with you and bring them on board. I mean, I remember at Odyssey, there are a lot of people with a lot of huge goodwill and just wanting to do something really positive. What was it going to be? And there was one project which, in a way, the company was betting the ranch on. This was the future. This is going to be the answer to everything. And in my view, it wasn't. On paper, it should work, But for whatever reason, every aspect of the market relationship didn't work. So that had to be torn down. And in that period when you are still trying to understand the fit, what is this organization capable of? Where is the need in the market that we can meet? This guy comes across with a funny accent from another side of the planet, and he's shutting things down. And this is scary. And, you need a result very quickly. Yeah. And I built this around social justice. That was the zeitgeist. That was inspiring a generation, more than a generation. It's where energy was. It was where connect people. It was where connect religion and mainstream. And there was energy there. And we, in the first year, built around 2 big projects. One was bed nets, malaria. There was momentum. Tony Blair, his Faith Foundation, was getting behind that. Gates was behind it. It was something that you could see, and suddenly you were part of something bigger, and the staff felt that. It wasn't going to be our future, but it would give a taste of what that future could be like. The other was the environment conference in Copenhagen at the end of 2009. We sent 3 crews. We sort of, again, bet the ranch on that. But fundamentally, we were the people who followed religion at the summit. The idea that religion has something to say about stewardship of the planet, that it can motivate people, was important. And no one was covering that, and we did. And so we grew the brand into a very important area. Someone is going to give this perspective that's been lacking a voice, and they're going to give it a voice in the most exciting areas of engagement, multimedia. So that's where we began to plant the flag. And I think quite a few people saw that this is an exciting path. It's worth following this guy and this vision for a bit.
How do you continue to build a culture of collaboration in both the darker times of uncertainty and in the more prosperous times of having a goal and a vision?
Collaboration is the right word. I mean, you know, that there are decisions that a CEO has to make where only he or she can make them. There are others where I want your advice, and I'm going to listen. I may not take it, but I'm going to listen. And then there are decisions in areas where this is going to be more democratic. Who, you know, hands up all those who want to do this and that. Okay, I'll go with the majority. And it seems to me that it's a mix of all those. There are some that only the CEO can take. But if you're asking people to risk something, to go on a journey with them, they've really got to believe in it, and you've got to make them feel an important part of it. So I always say to people, I would much prefer to be telling you, just please, no more banging on my door, you know, than having to go out and say, well, someone please bang on my door, you know. It's got to come up, the energy's got to come up as well, and the passion, because the people outside the boss's door are going to have to do it.
Right.
And they need to feel that it's in there for them as well as in here. They need to feel that it's believable, it's doable, and it's important, and that they have an important role, because everyone needs to be believed in. I would always like to think that my managers, and certainly when I approach something, is to give people a chance to grow and believe in them. It doesn't always work, and for whatever reason the chemistry is wrong, and you know, it doesn't work. But in the main, get them to believe in you, the project, and get them to understand that you believe in them.
That media has changed drastically during the course of your career. It makes a big difference in the decisions you make. How have you navigated that and capitalized on it? How do you keep up with it?
The moment I probably came into this interview, and when I go out, something will have changed. At the moment, I keep getting these emails about drones with cameras on. And I'm thinking, I got to buy a drone. You know, I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but you know, it's.
But Odyssey needs a drone.
We need a drone. We need a drone. It's going to change things, and you know, there's a balance between just rushing after the latest sparkly thing and seeing how constructive its use can be. You know, I guess I just look for enthusiasm. In enthusiasm, you know, you're probably going to take a wrong path sometimes, and that enthusiasm, for the right reasons, may end you up in a cul-de-sac. But media is offering so many opportunities. Everything is up for grabs. Every business model has been ripped up. Every business plan, you know, after about 3 to 6 months, is out of date. So one thing that I always look, even before that, was flexibility. Companies that are too rigid, too staid, cannot move, they've got real problems. I mean, they're the dinosaurs. And the importance of being flexible, I think, is exacerbated, the need for that anyway, by how quickly technology changes. Skill sets. I mean, I remember starting off at Thames Television with film. We would go out and we would shoot on film. I think religion was quite late. You know, you'd go through current affairs, news. Yes, let's get electronic news gathering all the way down, and then, oh yes, there's religion. They're still doing film. And there, once we got to edit electronically, only one person in the building could edit, and they were like the most important figure in the process, and they were paid huge amounts of money. And you know, there was this mystery of editing. And I remember going into my first edit, and the guy looked at me and said, well, what do I do? What do you want me to do with this? And I said, well, we could cut there, you know. And so he did a few buttons and then showed me, and the cut had happened. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. Now, you know, my 19-year-old daughter will probably be able to use Final Cut Pro.
Right.
And I was talking to a brilliant young woman director yesterday about our next project. And she said she's already cutting one doc, but she's cutting it on Final Cut Pro on a laptop while dossing in a friend's apartment.
Mm.
These electronic editing suites in Thames in 1989-90 cost £1 million each. You know, it has empowered people. I created something called Video School at CTV See, which was fundamentally, the narrative needs to be changed about religion and its role in society, but to be honest, we as a production company cannot do that by ourselves. It has to be from the grassroots up. So if we empower people in the grassroots to create media, then in the shop window that is the web, then there is a chance to have an influence and an impact. My production company could make maybe 2-3 docs a year. That was a drop in the ocean. So now I remember we would start these teenagers off, something in their young 20s, and I'd bring them into a studio and I'd say, you see this camera? And there'd be a big studio camera. And I'd say, you know, probably take you, you know, 6 months to a year to learn about this, and then, you know, half a lifetime to, you know, be really good at it and win awards. But luckily there's this, and behind my back I'd bring sort of a Sony 150, it's about that big. And I said, that's the future, you can use that, and we're going to teach you 5 basic approaches to filming, which won't make you Oscar-winning DPs, but it'll improve your, you know, your videos by hundreds of percent. That's what happened. And I remember just before that, I was in Gaza as a reporter. And there was a march and a shooting broke out, and we just had to scatter. We had a big camera, you know. Ooh. These are the cameras that probably cost more than someone's house, right. You know. And it was linked by an umbilical cord to the sound man, who was, you know, carrying a big Naga along. And these are heavy things, and we were sort of trying to, you know, run to escape the violence, which had really got out of control. And there was a Palestinian, and he had a little, I think a Sony 150 camera, and he said he'd been given it by, I think, an American network.
Really?
And he just took out the little digital piece, stuffed it in his pocket, and chucked the camera. You know, if he was in a position where he didn't want to carry anything. Right. And I thought, wow, you know, here's the future.
It's life-saving too.
Exactly, yeah. And it also changes the way you do programming, that as well. Yeah. I love location shooting. I love being where something is actually happening. In life, it's happening, and we are there recording it. We may bring people to it, but in effect, it's happening. Studio, everything is controlled, and whereas, you know, it's a fascinating challenge, studio, to be out where a story is unraveling before your eyes, and you have to think quickly how you're going to cover it. That's so exciting. Wow. And when cameras that small can operate with great lenses in low light, it's changed the way the sort of program that's being made is made. But I always remember an ad, and it was in a cinema, and it was about perspective again, and it's got a shot of a skinhead running down a street, looking really angry, and you know, intercut with a little old lady, you know, looking like this. So the assumption is this guy's about to beat the little old lady up. They then said, but see it from another angle, and you did the whole wide, and either the little old lady had fallen over, but she dropped something, and the skinhead had rushed up, picked up the bag, and given it to her. You know, so it's all about preconceptions, and again, journalism, I think, is about challenging preconceptions. So another reason why I find it very disappointing and problematic that news is lining up on one side of an argument or another. They're not giving you the 360 perspective. They are telling you that skinhead, by definition, is bad, and he's going to beat up that little old lady. And that's the end of the news.
Right.
Well, it's not.
Yeah.
I think the danger for editors is when they see one person taking, let's say, a smartphone piece from one position. What else was going on around there? What happened next? Why did the events leading up to that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So you just have to be careful.
Odyssey Networks is now working on a documentary about the school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut that happened over a year ago now. How are you treating that delicately, yet showing all the different perspectives as a project that you're responsible for? What are the things you have to take into consideration? What are the risks in doing this? What are hopefully the benefits?
It's a subject which is so entrenched and controversial in American society that you enter into that at your peril, that area. And as a Brit to do that, it's quite a risk, I think. I mean, each time a shooting's reported, I get people from Europe ringing me up and saying, oh my goodness, what on earth is going on there? We just find it very hard to understand. And I have to look at it from a perspective of a not-for-profit, wanting to help create change if we see something, if society thinks something is problematic. It doesn't work. We're not an advocacy organization. It's not a case of all guns are wrong, ban them, Life isn't like that. Life is interesting in the nuance, I may have my views, but I'm intrigued why that person, who's not stupid, and is not an immoral person, thinks my views are wrong. There's something interesting that I'm going to learn if I can create the trust. And Odyssey is about doing programming that creates a trust framework within which change may happen. It may not be the change each side wants, but hopefully we will progress, because nobody wants another school shooting. And both sides have to work together. So I tell my producers, we're interested in constructive controversy. It has to be constructive. We talked to the mayor of Newtown, and one thing she said to us was, no side must feel as though they're losing something. This, at the end of the dock, you mustn't feel that my side has lost. Otherwise, how are we going to move forward? But you have to honor the real feelings and emotions of individuals and of a community. And much of the work we're doing is looking at community resilience. How does a community cope with tragedy on that scale? Where do teachers fit in, first responders, counsellors, lawmakers, religious leaders, priests, ministers, rabbis, imams? How can they help in community? So it's not just about let's ban guns or not ban guns. That would be completely wrong, and I don't think would help at all. It's about exploring, hopefully constructively. I remember doing a documentary. It was the first one we did at Odyssey, Serving Life. And we did it with Forrest Whitaker, and we did it for the Oprah channel. And it was about following lifers in Angola jail in Louisiana as they, what I call were death buddies to dying inmates in the prison hospice. And the tagline was, if killers can care, the rest of us have no excuse. And it was about seeing if a life had been thrown away, life without parole, and tossed on the garbage heap as far as society was concerned. That person has nothing to offer. Actually, deep down buried, there was something, a spark that could be relit of compassion. And that's what happened in the 6 months we filmed. And I remember watching this film and listening to some of these inmates, and they were saying some of the most profound things I'd ever heard, And I studied theology. I just followed philosophers, did philosophy. I followed political leaders, and these kids got basically thrown in jail at aged 18, many of them. Hardly any education. But their perspective on what this did to them, they'd never get out. But their views of life in caring for someone who was dying and going through, sharing that death evening, the night of someone dying, where they would stay up next to them. And what that did to their view of life, they were all philosophers. They're amazing. And I remember going to university talking about leadership and saying, you may come out of here with a big degree, but I'm telling you, never ignore the person you think is way down the list and doesn't have anything to contribute, because something will come from the most unexpected place, and you should honor that and respect it. So that's a lesson that I think all leaders should have, and they should learn it every day, because it is a hard one. People look at you as a leader and expect you to know. That's why you're the leader, because you know. And you won't always have the answers.